Hello and welcome to everyone who could join us today. I am Faria Rehman and I lead all efforts related to API specifications at APIMatic. I am also joined by my teammate Ali Raza here today, who is an OpenAPI tech lead. In the webinar today, we are really excited to talk about our recently launched VS Code extension that can help you refine your API definitions for better SDK and documentation generation. I will start by giving a bird's eye view of everything the extension has to offer, and Ali will then dive a bit deeper into the various capabilities of the extension. Are you ready, Ali?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Great, then let's get started. So, the plan is to quickly cover what APIMatic is and our motivation behind building the VS Code extension, and then to take you through the demo of the extension's key features. And in the end, we will address your questions, if any, in a Q&A session. In case you are a new user and wondering what we do at APIMatic, here's a very quick review of it. Well, APIMatic is a developer experience platform where our goal is to help API providers easily generate SDKs in multiple languages for their APIs, along with HTTP and language specific reference documentation. Our ultimate goal is to help reduce API integration costs and maximize API consumption. Before we start with a proper demo of the extension, it is, of course, important to establish why we created an extension in the first place. If I only talk about the last few months alone, APIMatic received a large number of API definitions. Out of those, surprisingly, 95% contain at least some issue related to standard compliance. That includes, for example, cases where there are broken $f references. Then 53% of those API definitions were not fully ready for SDK generation. For example, one of the common issues we've seen affecting code generation is inline schemas. And lastly, 68% of them could not produce a user friendly documentation because they lack descriptions and examples for various components of their API definition. So, why are we seeing stats like these anyway? There are, after all, so many tools out there for validating and linting API definitions, including Spectral. Well, for standard compliance, we realized that tools were often a bit too lenient and flexible and did not try to ensure 100% compliance. For SDK and documentation generation, we were surprised to see that the tools did not offer any out of the box rule sets that the users could quickly use for improving their API definitions. So, at APIMatic, with our prime focus being ease of API consumption and a better developer experience, we realized that having high quality API definitions was crucial for our users looking to generate code or documentation from their APIs. And to help fill that gap that we saw earlier, we decided to create our very own VS Code extension. VS Code was kind of a natural choice since it's a fairly popular tool among developers. Well, the extension comes packed with more than 1200 out of the box rules for validation and linting, along with more than 200 rules specifically targeting code generation and around 100 rules focused solely on documentation. So you won't need to spend time hunting for what's wrong and can simply find all the information you need at one place. Let's now dive into the demo and see the extension's key features in more detail. In the first part of the demo, I will cover steps to help you quickly get started with the extension. I will show you how to install the extension and then authorize yourself with APIMatic to begin using the extension features. So here I have my VS Code open with the extension side view in focus. I will now go ahead and search for the APIMatic extension in Marketplace. Here we go. So I will simply click on install and that should just take a couple of seconds. Alright, so when the extension gets installed, you should be able to see this APIMatic logo here. Let me go ahead and accept the terms and conditions. And that opens up the getting started walkthrough, which you can go through in your own time. I will close it for now and move to the APIMatic view. Now to access the extension's features, I need to authorize myself with APIMatic first. So I click on the authorize button here. It will ask for my permission to open the login page in my browser. So I will go ahead and open that. Now, since I was already logged into my APIMatic account, I see this window here. But if you're a new user, you will need to sign up or log in first. Don't worry, it should just take you a couple of steps and then you can come back here and complete your authorization. So I'll just go ahead and click on the open button here, which will redirect me back to my VS Code. And then finally, I will just click here and my authorization is complete. To confirm that, I will open the manage session view from here, which will show me the name and my email address with which I logged in. So that's cool. And if I ever need to remove my account's access from the extension, I can simply use the reset and logout option here. Now that you are authorized, the next steps are to set up a dedicated workspace for your API files, add an API definition to it, and start validating it. Let me show you how. As you can see, the extension offers you several options here to help set up an API workspace. If you already have a workspace folder open in your VS Code and you wish to manage your API files in it, then just select the first option, use current workspace folder, as that will help open that folder as your dedicated API workspace. Or if you wish to select a different workspace folder, then you can use the second option instead. In my case, I have an empty API workspace here that I would like to select as my API workspace in the extension, so I will go back and use the first option to select it as my API workspace. There you go, the extension now makes my workspace visible in the APIMatic side view here. When I add some files to it, they will become visible here as well. For any reason, if I need to unselect this folder from the extension, so I can use the Close API Workspace option in the Manage Session view here. Moving on, I now have an empty API workspace but no API file to work with, so let's fix that. Again, the extension offers me several options here to add an API definition file to my workspace. I can add a predefined sample file, or I can import an existing file from my local system, or if I know the public URL of an API definition file, I can import that as well. But if I'm working from scratch and I don't already have an API definition file, then I can simply create an empty API definition file, or I can create a file from a template by answering a few simple questions. In the interest of time, I will choose the first option to add a pet store sample file to my workspace. So I will go ahead and click on that. I will use JSON as my input format. There you go. The pet store file is now added to my workspace. Now, you may or may not have noticed, but as soon as I added the API definition file, the validation ran over it, and I can see a few warnings here and there. I can also see that my left views are populated. So what happened is that the validation gets auto-triggered whenever the workspace is initially loaded, or whenever a file is added or removed, or when changes to a file are saved. But if you wish to trigger the validation manually for some reason, you can use the Validate Workspace option from here in the status bar. In the second part of the demo, I will show you how the extension makes it easier for you to manage and work with your API files. Everything related to your workspace files is actually managed within the Workspace File Navigator view of the extension. Let's talk about it now. So here I have a different workspace open with a slightly modified version of the pet store API definition. I have basically split the schemas from the pet store file into multiple files here, as you can see. It is actually quite common to see large OpenAPI files split into multiple files for easier management and for better component reusability. So now let's see how the extension can help you manage multi-file API definition files like these more easily. Let's switch to the APIMatic view for that. As you can see here that all the files from my workspace are visible here in the Workspace File Navigator view. My entry API definition file is highlighted a bit differently and labeled with an API tag to help differentiate it from the rest of the API files and to make it easier for me to spot it from the rest of the files. I can click on it to open it in the editor, and if I need to navigate to a different file, I can then do that from the same view as well. In other words, I don't need to switch between the Explorer and the APIMatic view to do my file navigation. This view is already designed to help me efficiently navigate and manage my API files. So this space is basically meant to be my focused API workspace. If there are a bunch of extra files in my API workspace that have nothing to do with the API, then I am better off without them. Here's one example. I have a README file that basically describes the project. That's great, but I don't need to work with this file while I'm working on my API definition. So I'll go ahead and exclude this file from my workspace using this corner option. This option basically adds the README file into an ignore list so that the extension no longer cares about it. The README file is no longer visible here. It still exists in my Explorer view because it's not removed or deleted, but it's simply hidden from view here to create a more focused space. If I have a long list of such files, then excluding them this way will not just create a focused workspace, but will also help improve performance. Moving on, if you're already an APIMatic user, then you might be familiar with the APIMatic metadata file that helps you control and configure various processes while using APIMatic products. So the Workspace File Navigator view helps you auto-generate the metadata file using this option here. I can click on it, select a couple of processes I'm looking to configure, and that will help generate a fully pre-initialized metadata file here that I can work with quite easily. Now, there are a couple of other options as well that I'll just quickly go over. In my case, I have a very small workspace with just a single API definition file, but it's possible to have multiple API definitions in the workspace. And if you are having trouble locating the main entry files for those API definitions, then you can use the reveal option here to bring them all into focus. Then if your files and folders have gone out of sync because of changes outside the VS Code, then you can use this refresh option here to update the list. Then there is an edit option in the top bar and in front of each file as well. If I click on it, it will take me to that file in the Explorer view from where I can then perform different actions like rename, delete, or whatever I'm looking to do. The third part of the demo will focus on how the different views of the extension can help complement your API definition, editing, and validation processes and help make them more efficient. The first such view is the Workspace Validation Summary view that shows you an overall score of the workspace, a bird's eye view of all the problems, and also lets you generate validation reports in a format of your choice. Let's dive into that now. So I've switched back to my original single file patch to workspace here. Here's the Workspace Validation Summary view just below the Workspace File Navigator view. Each time that the validation for your workspace completes, you should be able to see an overall pass-fail status here, and then a score out of 100, which you should aim to keep above 90 at least, and then the total count of issues across the workspace. And then the list of issues are further grouped into these categories that you see here. In fact, there are 3 broad categories into which the issues are grouped. The first one is severity. So there can be issues that are blockers, errors, warnings, or informational messages. The second category is based on the type of issues. So there can be validation problems for violations against standard rules, or there can be issues related to lint checks. The third category is related to your use case. So there can be issues specific to code generation or documentation generation. Now, if I open one of these categories, I can see a list of issues here. And then if I open one of these issues again, I can see the list of all instances for that issue across the workspace in one place. So I don't need to manually hunt for those instances myself. Now, if I click on the first instance, it will open up the affected file and also highlight the affected region, as you can see here. Selecting the instance also open up the details related to this instance in this active violations view as well, but I will talk about that later. Now, if you're looking to share all of this validation information with some of your external team members or stakeholders, then the extension offers you the ability to generate validation audit reports in just a few steps using the Generate Report option in this validation summary view here. Now, if I click on it, it asks me for my desired output format, which happens to be PDF. And if I'm looking to address a specific person or group, then I can mention their name here, and that will be included in the report. But for now, I will skip this step. Now the report starts generating. And there you go, the report has been successfully generated. Let me show you what it looks like. Here is the report. Let me open it up. So here's the report with the complete cover page, introduction section, table of contents. And then there is a dedicated section full of some useful stats that can come in quite handy if you're looking to get a quick overview of what your API state currently looks like. And then there are dedicated sections for each of the issues. Let me open one of those. So here for this issue, I can see a complete description, some hints, some external links, and a list of instances. In this way, there are details attached to each of the issues. The second view that can come in handy for you is the active violations view. It can show you more details specific to an issue instance, which we call a violation. This view updates itself automatically as you move your cursor around in the editor and can also show you details if a violation is selected from one of the views like this validation summary view. Let me show you all of that. Here's the active violations view that I was just talking about. It contains details about specific issue instances that we simply call violations. The view itself consists of two main sections. The first section contains details about a violation that you may have selected from somewhere like the validation summary view. The second section contains a list of active violations based on your current cursor position in the editor. So if I place the cursor here, where there is an active issue related to an undefined tag, then the same issue also becomes visible here in the active violations along with some details. And then if I move my cursor around, do notice that the view will update itself as well. So now if I move down a bit, I have a schema here called pet, which has two issues at the same cursor position. So the active violation view also shows me both of those issues with details here. Next, let me introduce an error here by removing the t from the type value and saving everything. As expected, an error has occurred. So now let's see what details the active violations view shows me for this particular issue. I can see the violation message here, the severity, the location, and path information. And then I see some additional metadata here, which is very specific to the issue here. So for example, the issue is that the schema type is invalid. And the metadata here tells me that the invalid type in question is object, which of course is the value that I messed up with. Now this kind of metadata can vary from issue to issue, but the important thing is that metadata like this can help provide additional context that can help you understand how or why an issue occurred in the first place for this particular violation, which can be quite useful. Then there are also certain cases where an issue can occur for a component because of how and where the component has been referenced by other components. Debugging such issues can be quite tricky in a typical validator setup. So for example, in the past, I've seen users accidentally referencing the schema object in place of the parameter object, which resulted in really mind-boggling errors. So to help our users tackle such issues more easily, we've introduced what we call the call trees, which you can see here as well. The call trees are basically a list of components that are referencing the currently affected component. And if you want, you can see further down which components are then referencing those components, and so on. So for my pet example, I can see that there are two components that are currently referencing my pet schema. I can navigate to those components, see if there's something that feels wrong in how it's being referenced. Of course, there isn't. So I'll just go back to my original location, fix the error, and that's it. Understanding an issue is important for resolving it properly, but we all know that hunting for relevant documentation is time-consuming and frustrating. So we build the documentation within the extension in a dedicated Learn More view. That way you won't have to switch context each time and can find the information more quickly. Let me show you how. Here's the Learn More view just below the Active Violations view. By default, it doesn't show any details yet because you need to explicitly select a problem first. There are several ways to do that, so let's explore those. In the editor where you have an issue visible, you can simply click on the code which is visible next to the message to open its details. There you go. Now you can see some details here in the Learn More view. Similarly, you also have a problems view here where you have a code visible next to each of the message. You can click on any of these codes and again the Learn More view will be updated accordingly. Then there is another option that you can choose. In the workspace validation summary, you have a list of issues here, and you can simply click on this tiny question mark visible next to an issue title. Again, the Learn More view was updated to reflect the information for that particular issue. Then in the active violations view again, I can see question marks next to the issue title that I can click and see details for the issue in the Learn More view accordingly. So now let's see what details the Learn More view actually shows. First, it shows you the issue title, which explains what's wrong. Then it shows you a detailed description, which tells you what was expected. Then there are a list of tips that you can follow to try and fix the issue. And then there is a list of external links that you can follow to find more details about the issue. For example, here I can see links to the OpenAPI standard. And lastly, you can also copy the rule ID or the rule set ID for this issue, which can be handy if you are configuring validation. Raza will be shedding some more light on that later. And you can also click on the View More option here to open all of these details in a separate tab, where all the information is more readable and there are also more fine-grained details available as well. When you're editing API definition files, you might feel the need to refer to the specification standard documentation to see how something should work. We have a small, slightly hidden feature to help you do that easily as well. Here I have my OpenAPI file open in the editor, and if you look closely at the bottom right corner of my status bar, you'll notice that the name and version of the OpenAPI format is listed here along with the small book icon. Let me go ahead and click on it, and that should open up the OpenAPI standard document in a separate tab. There you go, which I can scroll through and consult as needed. That wraps up the introduction and the first three major parts of the demo. Ali will now be telling you more about the validation-related capabilities of the extension and how, if you're already an APIMatic user, the extension offers certain features to streamline your workflows. Over to you now, Ali.
Thank you so much, Faria. And as Faria just mentioned in the fourth part of the demo, we will watch how this VS Code extension actually helps you refine your API definitions in order to automatically generate high-quality SDKs and the API documentation. Also, as mentioned earlier, this extension offers plenty of out-of-the-box rules in addition to the standard rules, which ensures your API definitions is standard compliant, as well as ready for the code and documentation generation. So now let's take a look at some of the common issues we see around these areas and how the extension helps you tackle them. Okay. So in order to showcase the validation and the linting capabilities of the VS Code extension in detail and in a better way, I managed to grab one of the SendGrid's OpenAPI definitions from their GitHub repository, and I have it open here in my API workspace in the VS Code extension. First of all, let's talk about the size of the API description that we are working with, right? So as you can see, it is quite large file with around 50,000 lines and about 3 MBs in size. So usually the bigger the API definition, the more issues it contains, which is the case here as well. And from this API definition, the extension has successfully managed to grab around 7,000 plus issues. And these issues are divided into two groups, which are validation and the linting. Definitely, there are other segregations as well, which I'll get to it in a bit. But looking at the validation messages, it seems like that the OpenAPI definition we are working with is mostly valid against these standards, right? Because it only has a total of 5 validation messages, while everything else has mostly to do with the linting. If I talk about the other segregations, a few hundred of the messages are affecting the code generation specifically, while around 6,000 violations are related to the documentation. The VS Code extension also provides an overall validation score of the API definition file, which in our case is 67%. Not great, but it's not too bad either. Now the question is, since there are a lot of issues in the file, where do we start fixing them? So in order to prioritize these issues, your first goal should be to make your API definition conform to these standards, right? And this extension helps you verify your API definition against all the mandatory checks from these standards to ensure that your API works well across the tools. And any standard compliance issues found will then be listed under the validation label here. Now, if I expand this section, I see that this API has 5 such problems related to explicitly defining the authorization and the accept headers as parameters. But this is an issue because OpenAPI standard does not allow defining the authorization and the accept parameters explicitly, and it clearly says that these headers, if defined, will be completely ignored. In other words, this information is redundant and should not be defined. But interestingly, this API definition already defines and applies the relevant security schemes and the expected responses and their types. So this information is definitely extra and should be removed to become fully compliant with these standards. Now, moving on to the linting section that shows you a combined list of issues affecting both SDK and the documentation generation, as well as other use cases. One of the most common issues we have seen in APIs are inline schemas. There are around 1,000 inline schemas in this API definition, which are all anonymous and have no unique names assigned to them. This means that during the code or the documentation generation, the names would be auto-generated by the tool. And auto-generated names are not necessarily user-friendly, which can badly compromise the quality of your SDK in the documentation. Next, if I just look at issues specific to SDK generation, there are plenty of those as well. Let's take a look at them. Here is an interesting one. See how there are 2 tags in the operation that are only different based on their case. From a code generation point of view, where different programming languages are involved, we consider these tags as conflicting because they can easily create problems during the compilation. Next, here is an operation ID which is greater than 50 characters. During code generation, operation IDs can be used for generating method names. So if you use such long names, you are compromising greatly on the user friendliness of your code. Now that you have an idea of how the extension detects violations in your spec, what if I tell you it can also fix those issues automatically? So the extension has a very interesting and helpful feature, which is auto-fixing the spec, that can automatically fix all of your violations of certain type of issues, that can eventually speed up your spec fixing process and can give you a quick head start where you won't required to do cumbersome steps, as those would be handled by our auto-fixers in the backend. In my last demo, we saw a very large spec with so many violations that can take a lot of time if we sit down to fix them manually, right? Let's try to fix them using the auto-fixing feature. In APIMatic, we have seen inline schemas as one of the most frequent issues in the user specs. So let's pick that one and try to fix it. This is the same standardize API that we used in our last demo. If you recall from the last demo, the API contained around thousands of inline schemas, right? Let me open up one of its instances And here you can see this is one of the inline schemas. Now, in order to fix it, I'll click on the autofix button from the bottom left side of the status bar. So what it does actually, it fetches the autofix plan first, and then it starts converting all inline schemas to global schemas using the auto-generated names. This way, you don't need to provide explicit names for each inline schema because the autofixers handles them itself. And here we go. See how this schema that I showed you earlier has been replaced with a $f object. Now let's save all the changes, which triggers the validation. And now that the validation is completed, you can see that all the violations related to the inline schemas has gone from this list, right? Also, the logs in this output channel will show you complete details of what changes were made, so you can refine things later if needed. In this way, the extension's autofix feature can save you the hassle of doing repetitive things manually, so you can focus only on what's important. Now, moving towards the sixth part of the demo, where I will demonstrate how you can control and fine-tune the linting process, as well as how you can add your own custom rules, despite the fact that the extension already enforces plenty of rules on your API definition. We will see how to disable linting rules, change their severity, and even add your own custom rules based on your requirements. So, we are back with the VS Code opened, and here I have a small API with a few endpoints from NASA's Epic API. This spec is fairly good with a score of around 96%, but still it does have some linting issues in it. Among all the issues, there is an issue which asks me to define a security mechanism in the spec, since most of the APIs are expected to be secure and should enforce at least some sort of authentication mechanism. However, this API does not require any form of authentication, therefore, I would like to disable this check. So in order to do that, I need to configure a metadata file which I can add from here using this file navigator view option. I will choose validation as a process I'm looking to configure. This will give me the metadata file along with a basic validation configuration object. It has a couple of options to turn off the linting as well as the code generation checks. And even I can configure individual rule sets or the rules using the rule sets object. For my purpose, where I need to disable a single rule, I would use the rule sets object. Now, in order to disable a rule, I need to know two things. First, the ID of the rule set to which the rule belongs, and second, the ID of the rule itself. And I can get both of this information from the Learn More view. So in order to get this information, I'll click on the question mark icon here against the rule which I need to configure, and it will show the details related to this rule in the Learn More view. Let me just scroll down to the bottom, and here is the rule ID and the rule set ID. I will copy the rule set ID and paste it here in the rule sets object. Now, I will add a rules property inside this object. Since I'm looking to skip a rule, I will add a skip property which is an array that contains the list of rule IDs that get skipped during the validation. Then I'll copy the rule ID from the Learn More view and paste it here. Now save everything and see, the violation regarding no security scheme applied is gone from the list. Next, I would prefer if there are any violations from this specific rule set, they should appear as errors instead of warnings. So in order to do that, I would add a new property called severity under the rules property and would set it as error. Now, if I save my file again, you will see that the warnings in the problem view below has changed to the errors. Great. So I'm not done yet. I now want to add a custom rule that makes sure that the operation IDs in my API definition use only alphanumeric characters and that the first letter is always an uppercase alphabet. To add this custom rule, I need to create a dedicated rule set file first. So I'll go ahead and create that. So if I go to the APIMatic's documentation, I get an example here that creates a custom rule set with a rule that enforces maximum length limit on the operation ID. Let me go ahead and copy this one and paste it here in my rule set. The first line sets unique ID for the rule set. Let's keep that as it is. Then there is a rules list in which only one rule is defined with this ID. But since I wish to allow only alphanumeric characters for my operation ID, I'm going to change it accordingly. The method I need for verification is going to be pattern. And the target is already set to the operation IDs using a JSON path expression, so we are good there. And since I changed the verification method earlier, I need to change the arguments I pass to it as well. In this case, I need to replace argument maximum with regex and set a regex pattern here for my alphanumeric conditions. And lastly, I will update the message to show to the users when this rule is violated. That's it. Our custom rule set is now ready. Let me save everything. In the end, we just need to apply this custom rule set via the APIMatic metadata file. So let's copy the rule set ID and go back to the metadata file. Create an entry for the rule set ID here and set its file path to link the metadata file and the custom rule sets file together. Save everything again to trigger the validation. Now let's check if we have got anything related to this new rule. Oh yes, we got this violation on this operation ID because it begins with a lowercase letter. Let's fix it and save the changes. And just like that, the warning is gone. Looks like our custom rule is working great. So in this way, we can configure the linting rules easily with the APIMatic metadata file and can add our own rules as well. At APIMatic, one of our most popular products is the API transformer with hundreds and thousands of transformations over the year. It lets you easily convert between different API specification formats like OpenAPI, RAML, Model, Visual, Postman collections, and many more. The extension also comes packed with the API transformer to let you easily convert your API specification format to one of your choice. I will now show you how to convert my OpenAPI definition to a Postman collection using the extension. Here, I have the same OpenAPI definition from the last demo. I'm going to go ahead and remove this rule set and metadata file to get rid of the extra violations that we added ourselves in the previous step. Now, to convert my OpenAPI file, I have a transform option here in the status bar. Let's click on it. It shows me so many options to which I can transform my OpenAPI definition, right? But since I'm looking to transform the OpenAPI into a Postman collection, so I'll go ahead and choose that as my export format. Let's select the same folder as my destination folder. Now it's asking me for my APIMatic authentication key, which I already have with me copied. So let me paste it here. You can also get your authentication key easily from APIMatic account settings. And there you go. I now have my transformed Postman collection that I can easily import into the Postman app, right? And this collection even comes loaded with request and response examples from my OpenAPI definition. If you are already an APIMatic user and feel the need to often import your APIs into the dashboard or validate the APIs before importing, then the extension will let you do both. I will show you how you can build your API workspace to ensure it is ready for export to APIMatic, then actually export it to the dashboard from where you can, easily generate SDKs in multiple languages, as well as complete developer experience portal with dynamic code samples. So let's dive into that. So to build the API workspace, I have a build option here in the status bar. Now you might be wondering why to build the API workspace before exporting to APIMatic, right? So during the export process, some additional checks are run on the API workspace to verify that the API workspace is valid and does not contain any blockers or the issues. So the build process actually helps us verify beforehand that the export will not give us any trouble, right? But if your API workspace is valid, then in most cases, there should be no such problem. So I just ran the build and it shows a build success message. So we are good to go for the export now. As you can see, besides the build button, we have an export button as well. So as I click on this button, it starts exporting the API workspace to APIMatic. And it's done. My API workspace seems to have exported successfully. Let me go to the APIMatic dashboard and reload it to see if we have the exported API here. So here it is. Let me now generate a developer experience portal and give you a sneak peek of it. I'll click on the generate button here. Click on proceed. Click on the preview API portal. Here we have a complete portal auto-generated in just a few seconds from the API definition that we exported, right? And that too in multiple languages. I can customize it later if I need. And here I have the .NET docs. Now let me open an endpoint here that can fetch an image from NASA's archives. Now if I click on try it out, I get a beautiful image as a response. I can also click here on the Get SDK button to download full .NET SDK. And moreover, I can even get the API definitions in multiple formats from here. In this way, you can get a complete developer experience package just from your API definition. That wraps up the demo of our VS Code extension. We hope you find it useful and that it motivated you to take your API definitions to the next level as well. I will now answer any questions you might have. Thank you.